Hi everyone. Today in this video we are going to discuss the proton pump inhibitors versus H2 blockers. Both of these categories can be used to decrease the gastric acid secretion, but how they are going to work and how can they control the gastric acid secretion to the different types of stimuli. Gastric acid secretion mainly decreased by two types of drugs. First one is the H2 antagonists. These H2 antagonists can be easily identified by their suffix tidine. So we have so many drugs like the cimetidine, ranitidine, famotidine, nizatidine. In this way, the drugs having the suffix tidine, they are the H2 antagonists and they can decrease the gastric acid secretion. On the other hand, we have well-known drugs, the proton pump inhibitors. These PPIs are going to inhibit the proton pump, which is the H plus K plus ATPase pump. Thereby, they can decrease the gastric acid secretion. And these proton pump inhibitors are going to end with the suffix prazole. So we have so many drugs like omeprazole, rabeprazole, pantoprazole, lansoprazole. In this way, the proton pump inhibitors end with the suffix prazole. Now, which type of drugs are going to control the gastric acid in a better way? Whether the H2 antagonists, which are also called as H2 blockers, otherwise the proton pump inhibitors. We can compare the proton pump inhibitors with the H2 blockers in three aspects. First one is the duration of action, and second one is the spectrum of action, and third one is the mechanism of action. Within the duration of action, which is going to show a long-term effect on the gastric acid suppression. Here the proton pump inhibitors are going to show advantage in controlling the gastric acid secretion for a longer period. As these drugs are going to inhibit the proton pump irreversibly, they can decrease the gastric acid secretion, which can be observed up to the 3 days. On the other hand, H2 blockers can show their activity up to few hours, so they have short duration of action. So at this point, proton pump inhibitors are having some advantage, but H2 blockers will show immediate action on the gastric acid secretion, which lasts for a short period. Now let us the second point of difference, spectrum of action. Both of these category of drugs can be given in the clinical conditions like the GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disorder, as well as in the treatment of peptic ulcers, where both of these category of drugs are going to decrease the gastric acid secretion. But in few of the clinical conditions like the Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, as well as in the H. pylori infection, the proton pump inhibitors are better preferred compared with the H2 blockers. So H2 blockers are not having a significant action on these two clinical conditions, and they are mainly used for the treatment of GERD as well as peptic ulcers. So here again the proton pump inhibitors show some advantage because they can act on all these four types of clinical conditions. And third one is the mechanism of action. So in order to understand mechanism of action and which category of drugs are going to act better in controlling the gastric acid secretion, first of all we have to see how the gastric acid is secreted. Now let us see how gastric acid is going to be secreted. Now if we consider the gastric parietal cells, on the gastric parietal cells we can observe three types of receptors. First one is the cholecystokinin receptors on which the gastrin can act. And second one is the H2 receptors on which the histamine can act. And finally M3 receptors are present on which the acetylcholine can act. Now the gastrin can bind to these cholecystokinin receptors, thereby it can increase the protein synthesis, and one of the protein that is going to be expressed is the proton pumps. In this way, gastrin can increase the expression of the proton pumps, which increase the gastric acid secretion. Similarly, histamine can act on the H2 receptors, and once they are going to be activated, they can result in the activation of the adenylyl cyclase system. This adenylyl cyclase system then converts the ATP into cyclic AMP. Similarly, acetylcholine can bind to these M3 receptors, which are coupled with the phospholipase C system. And when this system is going to be activated, they will convert the phosphatidyl inositol biphosphate into IP3 as well as diacylglycerol. In this way, these three mediators can act on their respective receptors to increase the secondary messengers. Now, the cyclic AMP can stimulate the protein kinase A, and these protein kinase A can then stimulate the entry of the calcium into the gastric parietal cells. Now, the calcium can enter into the gastric parietal cells, which can promote the proton pumps. Similarly, IP3 and diacylglycerol can also increase the calcium entry. All this can stimulate the proton pumps. So when these proton pumps are going to be stimulated, they can increase the exchange of the proton for the potassium. In this way, proton is going to be secreted into the lumen. and chloride ions can be passively transported into the lumen. In this way, HCl is going to be secreted. Whatever may be the mediator, gastrin, histamine and acetylcholine, all these are going to increase the gastric acid secretion, which is finally controlled by the proton pump. Now within the gastric parietal cells, the different types of stimuli are going to work to release the gastric acid. For example, the gastrin is released from the G cells. G cells are the gastrin producing cells. And once this gastrin is going to be released, it can act on the cholecystokinin receptors. Similarly, the histamine is released from the ECL, the enterochromaffin cells, which are the mast cell type of cells from which the histamine can be released, and it can act on the H2 receptors. And finally, the parasympathetic system can release the acetylcholine, and this acetylcholine act on the muscarinic receptors, thereby it can stimulate the gastric acid secretion. In this way, whether the gastrin, histamine or acetylcholine, all these are going to act on the respective receptors, thereby they are going to increase the gastric acid secretion, but their main target is same. All these are going to act on the same target, that is nothing but the proton pump. This proton pump is the H plus K plus ATPase pump, where the H plus ions are going to be secreted outside and potassium is going inside. So all types of stimuli can release the gastric acid by finally acting on the proton pump. Now how these H2 blockers are going to act? H2 blockers are acting like an antagonist at the H2 receptors. Thereby they are going to inhibit the histamine mediated gastric acid release. One of the main stimuli for the gastric acid secretion is the histamine. So that's why H2 blockers can inhibit the gastric acid secretion mediated by histamine by acting on the H2 receptors. But these drugs cannot inhibit the gastric acid secretion by other types of stimuli. For example, in the Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, which is a gastrin producing tumor, the gastrin is more released, which acts on the cholecystokinin receptors, which increase the expression of the proton pumps. In this way, in the Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, the gastric acid is more secreted, but it cannot be controlled by H2 antagonists. Similarly, excessive cholinergic transmission can also increase the gastric acid secretion, which is again not blocked by the H2 antagonists. On the other hand, the proton pump inhibitors are one category of drugs which are directly blocking the proton pump. Thereby they can decrease the gastric acid release, which is promoted by the different types of stimuli. So proton pump inhibitors can block the release of the HCl, whether the stimuli is a gastrin or histamine or acetylcholine. In this way, the proton pump inhibitors can control the gastric acid secretion for different types of stimuli. On the other hand, H2 antagonists are going to act only for the histamine mediated stimuli. And apart from this, proton pump inhibitors are going to produce an irreversible inhibition of the enzyme. Thereby they can produce their effect for longer period. They can show their activity up to the 3 to 4 days. That's why they can control the gastric acid secretion more efficiently compared with the H2 antagonists. So both category of drugs are going to work by their own mechanism. H2 blockers are going to decrease the gastric acid secretion, which is mediated by histamine or allergic response. And at most of the times, H2 blockers can control the gastric acid secretion in a very efficient way. But whenever the H2 blockers are unable to control, then we can use the proton pump inhibitors, which are better drugs to control the gastric acid secretion. Under mild conditions, we can use the H2 blockers. But whenever the H2 blockers are not effective, then we can use the proton pump inhibitors, which can block the many types of stimuli so that the gastric acid secretion can be thoroughly controlled. So that's for today. If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel, share this video with your friends, post your comments in the comment box. Thank you for watching this video.